If he is not removed from this seat right now, I will call airport security, the flight attendant said sharply, her voice slicing through the quiet cabin like a blade. The man did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there in the narrow aisle, shoulders slightly hunched, one hand gripping the back of the seat, as if it were the only thing holding him upright. His clothes were plain, slightly wrinkled, the kind of outfit people stopped noticing the moment they saw something more expensive nearby. A few passengers glanced up, then quickly looked away, unwilling to get involved. Others whispered, their eyes filled with quiet judgment. The plane was minutes from departure. The overhead bins were already closed, and tension spread faster than the recycled air flowing through the cabin vents. He looked exhausted, not just tired from a long day, but worn down in a way that made his presence feel almost out of place among polished suits and designer handbags. He reached into his pocket slowly, as if searching for something that might prove he belonged there, but his hand stopped halfway, then dropped back to his side. The flight attendant crossed her arms, clearly expecting compliance, her expression firm, impatient, already deciding who he was without hearing a single word. Around them, the hum of conversation returned in low murmurs, the kind that carried judgment without accountability. Then, from a few rows back, a voice broke through the tension. It was calm, steady, and completely unexpected. "You can take my seat." Heads turned. Conversation stopped. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The woman who had spoken stepped into the aisle, her movements simple, unpolished, but certain. Her name was Emily Brooks, and nothing about her suggested wealth or influence. Her sneakers were worn at the edges, her carry-on bag scuffed from years of use, and her jacket looked like it had seen too many winters. But her eyes were clear, unwavering, fixed not on the crowd, but on the man standing alone. The flight attendant blinked, caught off guard. "Ma'am, that is not necessary," she said, her tone softening just enough to sound polite, but not enough to hide her disapproval. Emily shook her head gently. "It is fine. I can stand, or I can take whatever seat is left. He looks like he needs it more than I do." A ripple moved through the passengers. Some frowned. Some exchanged glances. One man near the window scoffed under his breath, muttering something about people who did not know how things worked. But Emily did not react. She stepped closer, offering a small, reassuring smile to the stranger. Up close, she could see the faint shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the quiet hesitation in the way he held himself, like a man used to carrying weight no one else could see. "Please," she said softly. Her voice meant only for him now. "Take it." The man looked at her, truly looked this time, as if trying to understand why a complete stranger would do something no one else in the cabin had even considered. And for the first time since the confrontation began, something shifted in his expression, something almost like disbelief, or maybe something deeper, something he had not felt in a very long time. The man did not move right away. For a brief second, the world around him seemed to slow, the hum of the engines fading into the background as he studied her face, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that this was a gesture she might regret. But Emily did not look away. She stood there in the narrow aisle, steady despite the eyes on her, as if the decision had already been made long before this moment. Finally, he gave a small nod, almost reluctant, and stepped forward. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice low and rough, like someone who had not spoken much in days. It was not the kind of thank you people said out of habit. It carried weight, something deeper, something that made Emily pause for just a fraction of a second before she smiled again. "It is just a seat," she replied softly, though something in the way he looked at her made it feel like more. The flight attendant exhaled through a tight smile, clearly displeased, but unable to argue without causing a scene. "Very well," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "But we need to resolve this quickly before departure." Her tone had shifted, less sharp now, but still edged. With control, the man lowered himself into the seat slowly, as if his body was reminding him just how exhausted he really was. The moment he sat down, his shoulders dropped slightly, and he closed his eyes for a brief second, like someone finally allowed to rest after holding himself together for too long. Emily stepped back, gripping the top of a nearby seat as the plane gave a slight jolt. A different flight attendant approached, whispering to the first, both of them glancing toward the man, then back at a handheld device, as if trying to reconcile something that did not quite match. Across the aisle, a well-dressed passenger leaned toward his companion, his voice low but not low enough. "People will do anything for attention these days," he muttered. "Or maybe he just knows how to play the system." A soft laugh followed, sharp and dismissive. Emily heard it, but she did not react. Instead, she shifted her weight, steadying herself as more passengers settled in, the overhead lights dimming slightly as the cabin prepared for departure. The engines grew louder, a deep, constant vibration that filled the space beneath their feet. The man opened his eyes again and looked up at her. "You are going to stand the whole time," he said, his voice carrying a hint of concern now. Emily shrugged lightly. "I have done worse," she said. "It is only a few hours." He studied her again, this time with something closer to curiosity. "That is not the point," he replied. There was a pause, the kind that stretched just long enough to feel meaningful. Then, almost as if he was choosing his words carefully, he added, "You should not have to give something up for someone you do not know." Emily tilted her head slightly, considering that. "Maybe," she said, "but sometimes people need something more than we do in that moment." The plane began to taxi, the subtle movement causing a ripple through the cabin as everyone adjusted instinctively. A child somewhere behind them asked a question in a small, sleepy voice, and a parent answered softly, trying to keep them calm. The world continued, ordinary and routine, even as something unspoken settled between the two strangers. The man glanced down at his hands, then back at her. For a moment, it looked like he might say something else, something important, but instead he simply nodded again, as if acknowledging a truth he had not expected to find in a place like this. A few minutes later, the plane lifted off the ground, the city lights below shrinking into a scattered pattern of gold and white. As the aircraft climbed higher, the cabin lights dimmed further, casting everything in a soft, muted glow. Emily adjusted her grip on the seat, bracing herself as the pressure shifted, her legs already beginning to ache. She did not complain. She did not ask for anything in return. And as the man sat there, finally still, finally allowed to rest, he watched her in silence, realizing that in a world where everything had a price, she had just given something without asking for one. The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that comes after the initial tension of departure fades, and people begin to retreat into their own small worlds. The overhead lights were dim now, casting a soft amber glow across rows of half-closed eyes and tilted heads. Somewhere near the back, a flight attendant rolled a service cart slowly down the aisle, the faint clink of plastic cups and bottles blending with the steady hum of the engines. Emily shifted her weight again, her fingers tightening briefly around the top of the seat as a dull ache spread through her legs. Standing still for too long always did that, a slow burn that crept upward, but she ignored it, focusing instead on her breathing, steady and quiet. A few seats away, the same well-dressed passenger from earlier glanced at her again, his expression still laced with disbelief. He leaned toward the aisle just enough to speak, his voice low but deliberate. "You know, he could have just booked the right seat if he really belonged here," he said, not even trying to hide the implication this time. "People like that count on sympathy." His companion nodded slightly, eyes flicking toward the man in the seat Emily had given up. "It is always the same story," she added softly. "They show up looking worn out and hope someone kind makes a mistake." The words hung in the air, subtle but sharp, designed to cut without drawing attention. Emily heard every word. She felt the heat rise in her chest, the instinct to respond flickering for a moment, but she held it back. Instead, she looked down at the man sitting in the seat. He had not reacted. His eyes were open now, but he was not looking at them. He was staring straight ahead, jaw set, as if he had heard far worse before and learned long ago that responding only made things worse. That silence said more than any argument could have. Emily took a slow breath, then spoke, her voice calm but firm. Or maybe, she said just loud enough for them to hear, he had a long day and needed a place to sit. The man near the window let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head as if the idea was almost amusing. "You are too trusting," he replied. "That is how people take advantage." Emily met his gaze this time, not with anger, but with something steadier. "Maybe," she said again, "but I would rather be wrong for helping someone than right for doing nothing." The conversation ended there, not because anyone agreed, but because there was nothing left to argue without exposing more than they intended. The cabin returned to its low hum, but the atmosphere had shifted, a subtle tension still lingering beneath the surface. A few minutes later, the service cart reached their row. The flight attendant who had first confronted the man paused, her expression carefully neutral now. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked him, her tone controlled, almost rehearsed. He looked up at her briefly, then shook his head. "No, thank you," he said. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if expecting something else, then turned to Emily. "And you, am," she asked, her voice softer, perhaps out of obligation, perhaps something else. Emily smiled lightly. "Water is fine," she said. The attendant handed her a small bottle, their fingers brushing for a brief moment. It was a simple exchange, but the earlier tension lingered in the space between them, unspoken but present. Emily took the bottle and twisted the cap open, taking a small sip before glancing down at the man again. Without saying anything, she extended the bottle toward him. He looked at it, then at her, surprise flickering across his face. "You should keep it," he said quietly. "You are the one standing." Emily gave a small shrug. "I could get another one," she replied. "You look like you need it." "More." For a moment, he did not move. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the bottle, his fingers brushing against hers, a brief contact that carried more weight than either of them expected. "Thank you," he said again, softer this time. He took a sip, then leaned back slightly, closing his eyes once more. But this time, there was something different in the way he rested, as if the simple act of being seen, of being treated with quiet respect, had lifted a weight he had been carrying far longer than this flight. And as Emily stood there, steady despite the ache in her legs and the eyes still watching her from across the aisle, she did not realize that the quiet choices she was making, the small acts no one else thought twice about, were already beginning to change something far beyond this narrow cabin in the sky. Time seemed to stretch inside the dim cabin, the steady vibration of the aircraft becoming almost hypnotic as the hours passed. Most passengers had settled into uneasy sleep, heads tilted against windows or resting on folded arms, their earlier judgments fading into quiet indifference. But not everything had softened. Near the front, the same flight attendant who had first confronted the man returned, her steps measured, her expression now tighter than before, as if something unresolved continued to press against her sense of order. She stopped beside the seat, glancing down at him with a look that was no longer openly confrontational, but still carried a quiet insistence. "Sir," she said in a low voice, careful not to disturb too many others, "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again." The man opened his eyes slowly, as if pulled from a place deeper than sleep. For a moment, he did not respond. Then he reached into his jacket, his movements deliberate but unhurried, and pulled out a slightly creased boarding pass. He held it out without a word. The attendant took it, scanning it quickly, her brows knitting together just slightly. Something did not align. Her eyes flicked to the seat number, then to her handheld device, then back to him. The silence that followed was subtle but noticeable, like a thread pulled too tight. Across the aisle, a few passengers began to watch again, curiosity reigniting as tension quietly returned to the space. The well-dressed man leaned forward once more, unable to resist. "Problem?" he asked, his tone edged with interest rather than concern. The attendant ignored him, her attention fixed on the boarding pass. "This shows a different seat," she said finally, her voice controlled but firmer now. "You are not assigned here." The man met her gaze calmly. "I'm aware," he said. There was no apology in his voice, no defensiveness, just a simple statement of fact. That seemed to irritate her more than any excuse would have. "Then you understand why this is an issue," she replied. Emily felt the shift immediately. The fragile calm that had settled over the cabin was breaking again, and this time it felt sharper, more focused. She straightened slightly, her hand tightening on the seat in front of her. "I gave him my seat," she said, her voice steady but clear. The attendant turned toward her, her expression tightening further. Seating assignments are not transferable without approval," she said. "There are procedures." Emily held her ground. "Then approve it," she replied simply. A few nearby passengers let out quiet breaths, the tension thickening once more. The attendant hesitated, clearly weighing her response, but the presence of watching eyes seemed to push her toward firmness rather than flexibility. "It is not that simple," she said. "We have to maintain order on board." The man shifted slightly in his seat, then spoke before Emily could respond again. "There is no need to make this more complicated," he said, his tone still calm, but carrying a quiet authority that had not been there before. "If it is a problem, I will return to my assigned seat." Emily turned toward him immediately. "No," she said, more sharply than she intended. A few heads turned to the sound. She softened her voice, but not her resolve. "You needed this seat," she added. "That has not changed." He looked at her, something unreadable passing through his expression. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue, but instead he exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something internal. The attendant watched this exchange, her uncertainty growing, though she tried to hide it. "Sir, I will need you to comply," she said. The words were polite, but the pressure behind them was unmistakable. The man reached for the armrest, his fingers resting there for a second, as if deciding something. Then he began to stand. The movement was slow, deliberate, and for a brief moment, it felt like the entire cabin leaned in, waiting to see what would happen next. Emily stepped slightly forward without thinking, her presence instinctive, protective. "You do not have to do that," she said quietly. He paused halfway up, his eyes meeting hers again. There was a shift in that look now, something deeper, something that suggested this moment mattered more than anyone else in the cabin realized. And somewhere beneath the quiet tension, beneath the hum of the engines and the weight of unspoken judgment, something was beginning to change, though no one yet understood just how much. The man stopped halfway as he was about to stand, his hand still resting lightly on the armrest, his body caught between compliance and something else that had not yet been spoken. The flight attendant watched closely, waiting for him to finish rising, waiting for order to be restored the way she understood it. Around them, a few passengers shifted in their seats, some leaning slightly into the aisle, drawn by the quiet tension that refused to fade. Emily did not step back. Instead, she held her ground, her voice softer now, but unwavering. "Please," she said, not loudly, but with enough conviction to cut through the moment. The man looked at her again, and this time there was no hesitation in his eyes, only a quiet recognition of what she was offering, not just a seat, but a choice. Slowly, he lowered himself back into the seat. The movement was simple, but it changed everything. A ripple moved through the nearby rows, subtle but unmistakable. The flight attendant inhaled, clearly preparing to object, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the number of eyes now watching, or maybe it was the calm certainty in both of them that made confrontation feel suddenly misplaced. "This is highly irregular," she said finally, her voice tight but no longer sharp. "We will need to document this." Emily gave a small nod. "That is fine," she replied. The attendant lingered for a moment longer, then stepped back, turning away with a controlled movement that suggested she had chosen to let the situation stand, at least for now. The cabin slowly settled again, though the earlier ease did not fully return. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it, even if they could not name it. Emily adjusted her stance, her legs now carrying the steady weight of time, the ache more pronounced but still ignored. She reached into the side pocket of her bag and pulled out a folded napkin, the kind you pick up without thinking from a coffee shop counter. Without a word, she offered it to the man. He looked at it, then at her, a faint crease forming between his brows, as if he did not quite understand the gesture. "In case you need it," she said simply. He accepted it, unfolding it slowly in his hands. It was plain, slightly worn at the edges, but he held it as if it were something more. A moment later, she reached down again and pulled out a small snack bar, the wrapper slightly bent from being carried around all day. "You should eat something," she added. "It is a long flight." He hesitated this time, his fingers pausing just short of taking it. "You might need that," he said quietly. Emily smiled faintly. "I will be fine," she replied. "I had one earlier." That was not entirely true, but she said it without hesitation, without drama, as if it did not matter. He took the snack bar, his grip careful, almost respectful. "Thank you," he said again, the words softer now, carrying something that had shifted from simple politeness into something closer to gratitude. Across the aisle, the well-dressed passenger watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, clearly unconvinced, but no longer speaking. The earlier confidence in his judgment had dimmed, replaced by something quieter, less certain. The cabin lights flickered slightly as the plane adjusted altitude, and a gentle chime sounded overhead, reminding passengers to remain seated. Emily shifted again, her hand brushing against the back of the seat, her balance steady despite the subtle movement beneath her feet. She did not complain. She did not look for sympathy. She simply remained where she had chosen to be. The man unwrapped the snack bar slowly, taking a small bite as if testing something unfamiliar. Then he leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the dim aisle where Emily stood. For a long moment, he said nothing, but his eyes followed her movements, the quiet strength in the way she held herself, the absence of expectation in everything she had done. And somewhere in that silence, something settled into place, something neither of them fully understood yet, but both could feel beginning to take shape, as if the simple act of giving had opened a door neither of them had been looking for, but neither could now ignore. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane cruised at altitude, but inside his mind, there was no calm, no rhythm, no rest. He sat still in the seat Emily had given him, the napkin folded carefully in his hand, the half-eaten snack bar resting on the tray in front of him, untouched now. To anyone watching, he looked like a man finally getting the rest he needed. But behind his quiet expression, something far more complicated was unfolding. His name was Alexander Reed, though no one on this flight knew it. Not the passengers who had judged him, not the flight attendant who had questioned him, and not even the woman standing just a few feet away who had given him something no one else had offered. Respect without conditions. He leaned his head back slightly, his eyes closing for a moment, but sleep did not come. Instead, memories pressed forward, sharp and unrelenting. Just 12 hours earlier, he had been standing in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the skyline of New York City, surrounded by executives who spoke in measured tones, but carried quiet agendas behind every word. The company he had built over years, through risk and sacrifice, was slipping into uncertainty. A merger deal had collapsed at the last minute. Investors were pulling back. Headlines had already begun to shift, turning admiration into doubt. He could still hear the voices, calm on the surface but filled with pressure beneath. You need to stabilize the narrative. We cannot afford another mistake. The board is watching. He had nodded then, just as he always did, carrying the weight without letting it show. But something inside him had been wearing down long before that meeting. The constant scrutiny, the expectation to always be in control, the quiet understanding that trust in his world was always temporary and always conditional. That was why he had left without his usual team, without the assistants, without the polished image that followed him everywhere. He had booked a last-minute flight under his own name, but without any of the signals that usually cleared his path. No priority handling, no recognition, no protection. Just a seat, a ticket, and the anonymity he had not felt in years. Or at least, that was what he thought he would get. Instead, he had been reminded of something else entirely. How quickly people decide who you are based on what you look like. How easily respect disappears when there is nothing to prove you deserve it. He opened his eyes again, his gaze drifting toward Emily. She was still standing, her posture steady despite the strain that must have been building in her legs by now. She had not complained once. Not when people whispered, not when she was questioned, not even when it became clear that she would be uncomfortable for the rest of the flight. She had simply made a choice and stood by it. He watched her for a long moment, something shifting quietly in his chest, something unfamiliar. In his world, everything had a price. Every favor, every opportunity, every gesture came with expectation, with calculation. But what she had done had no calculation behind it, no benefit, no reason that made sense in the logic he was used to. And that was exactly why it stayed with him. He looked down at the napkin again, running his fingers along its edge, as if grounding himself in something real. Then he glanced at the snack bar, at the bottle of water he still held, small things that should not have mattered, but did. More than he wanted to admit. For the first time in a long time, Alexander Reed was not thinking about his company, or his reputation, or the endless decisions waiting for him on the ground. He was thinking about a stranger who had nothing and still chose to give. And somewhere between the quiet hum of the cabin and the dim glow of the overhead lights, he realized something he had not allowed himself to consider in years. That maybe, just maybe, what he had been searching for was not control, or power, or even success. It was something much simpler. Something he had just witnessed without warning. Something real. The seatbelt sign flickered on with a sharp chime, breaking the fragile calm that had settled over the cabin, and almost immediately, the plane dipped slightly, just enough to make a few passengers gasp under their breath. The smooth rhythm of the flight shifted into something uneven, the kind of subtle instability that makes people sit up a little straighter, fingers tightening on armrests without realizing it. A second later, a stronger jolt followed, and this time the reaction was louder. A child somewhere near the middle rows let out a startled cry, and a parent quickly tried to soothe them, their voice low but tense. The overhead bins rattled faintly, and a few loose items shifted in place. Emily instinctively braced herself, her hand gripping the back of the seat more firmly now, her feet adjusting to keep her balance as the floor beneath her seemed to tilt and settle in unpredictable ways. The flight attendants moved quickly, their calm professionalism returning as they secured carts and checked rows, but even their movements carried a hint of urgency. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened," one of them called out, her voice steady but raised just enough to cut through the growing noise. Another sudden drop made several passengers inhale sharply, the tension rising in waves. Emily glanced down the aisle, her eyes catching on the small child who had cried earlier. The child looked no older than 6, clutching a worn stuffed animal, their face pale, eyes wide with fear as the plane shuddered again. Without thinking, Emily stepped carefully toward them, moving against the slight pull of gravity as the aircraft shifted. "Hey," she said gently, crouching just enough to be at eye level while still holding onto his seat for support. "It is okay. Planes do this sometimes." The child shook their head, gripping the stuffed animal tighter. "It feels like we are falling," they whispered, their voice trembling. Emily offered a small, reassuring smile. "It feels like that, but we are not. It is just air moving around us. The pilots know exactly what they are doing." Another jolt hit, and the child flinched, but Emily stayed steady, her voice calm, unwavering. "See, we are still okay," she added softly. "You want to count with me until it feels better?" The child hesitated, then gave a small nod. "1, Emily said. 2, the child whispered back, their voice still shaky but softer now. Across the aisle, Alexander watched the scene unfold, his gaze fixed on her. There was no hesitation in her actions, no thought of whether she should intervene or stay out of it. She simply saw someone who needed help and moved toward them. Another wave of turbulence rolled through the cabin, less sharp this time, but still enough to keep everyone alert. A few rows ahead, a passenger called out to a flight attendant, their voice edged with panic, asking if this was normal. The attendant responded quickly, her tone practiced, explaining that it was temporary, that everything was under control. But it was Emily who held the child's attention, who kept their fear from spiraling into something worse. 3. Emily continued. 4. The child followed, their grip loosening slightly on the stuffed animal. Alexander leaned forward just slightly in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he took in every detail, the quiet strength in her voice, the way she anchored herself so the child could feel steady. It was not dramatic. It was not loud, but it was undeniable. When the turbulence finally began to ease, the cabin slowly exhaled as one, the tension draining out in small, quiet breaths. The seatbelt sign remained on, but the worst of it had passed. Emily gave the child one last, reassuring nod. "See, you did great," she said. The child managed a small smile, their fear replaced with something softer, something closer to trust. As Emily carefully made her way back to her spot in the aisle, her hand brushing against the seats for balance, Alexander did not look away. Because in that moment, it was no longer just about a seat, or a kind gesture, or even the quiet judgment of strangers. It was about something deeper, something that could not be measured or bought. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that what he was witnessing was not just kindness. It was strength in its purest form. The cabin slowly returned to a fragile calm, but it was not the same calm as before. Something had shifted, not just in the air, but in the way people were looking at one another. The earlier whispers had faded, replaced by a quieter awareness, as if the turbulence had unsettled more than just the plane. Emily moved back to her place in the aisle, her hand resting lightly on the seat for balance, her breathing steady again. The child she had comforted was now leaning against their parent, eyes half closed, the stuffed animal held loosely instead of clutched tight. It was a small change, but it carried weight. Alexander watched her return, his gaze following every step, every small adjustment she made to stay steady. When she reached his row again, he shifted slightly in his seat, turning toward her just enough to speak without drawing attention. "You handled that well," he said quietly. His voice was softer now, stripped of the distance it had carried before. Emily gave a small shrug, her expression simple, unguarded. "They were just scared," she replied. Anyone would have done the same. Alexander held her gaze for a moment, then shook his head almost imperceptibly. "No," he said, "not everyone would." There was no challenge in his tone, only certainty. That seemed to catch her off guard for a second, but she did not argue. Instead, she leaned slightly against the seat back, giving her legs a brief moment of relief. "You travel a lot," she asked after a pause, her voice casual, as if trying to return the moment to something normal. Alexander let out a quiet breath. "More than I would like," he answered. "It comes with the job." Emily tilted her head slightly. "What kind of job makes someone look that tired before the flight even starts?" she asked, a hint of curiosity slipping into her tone. He considered the question, his eyes drifting for a second before returning to her. "The kind where people expect you to have all the answers," he said, "even when you do not." She studied him for a moment, as if weighing that response, then gave a small nod. "That sounds exhausting," she said simply. There was no judgment in her voice, no attempt to analyze or fix it, just an acknowledgement that seemed to land more deeply than he expected. He let out a faint, almost surprised breath. "It is," he admitted. The honesty in that word lingered between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the plane filled the space again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt shared. Emily shifted slightly, her hand brushing against the top of the seat as she adjusted her stance. "What about you?" he asked after a moment, his tone softer now. "What makes you give up your seat for someone you do not know?" She let out a small laugh, not loud, but enough to break the weight of the question. "I do not know," she said. "I guess I just noticed you looked like you needed a break." She paused, then added, "And I know what that feels like." He leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. "You do," he said. It was not a question. Emily nodded, her gaze dropping briefly before returning to him. "I work 2 jobs," she said. "Morning shift at a diner, evening cleaning offices downtown." This trip is the first time I've taken a few days off in over a year. She said it plainly, without self-pity, as if it were just another fact. But there was a quiet weight behind it. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest, something unfamiliar. "And you still chose to stand," he said. She smiled faintly. "Sitting for a few hours is not going to change my life," she replied. "But maybe it changed your day." The simplicity of that statement settled over him in a way nothing else had. He looked at her, really looked this time, not as a stranger on a plane, but as someone whose choices carried meaning far beyond the moment. "It did," he said quietly. Emily held his gaze for a second, then looked away, almost as if she was not used to hearing something like that said so directly. The plane continued forward through the night, steady now, the earlier turbulence fading into memory. But between them, something new had taken its place. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. A connection built not on who they were supposed to be, but on who they had shown themselves to be when it mattered most. The plane began its gradual descent, the subtle shift in altitude almost unnoticeable at first, but marked by the soft chime that echoed through the cabin and the gentle change in engine pitch. Overhead, lights brightened slightly, pulling passengers out of their quiet bubbles as the reality of landing approached. Seat backs moved upright, window shades lifted, and a low murmur of conversation slowly returned, this time carrying a different tone than before. Emily adjusted her grip once more, rolling her shoulders slightly to ease the stiffness that had settled into her body after hours of standing. Her legs ached now, a deep, persistent soreness, but she did not show it. She simply exhaled and steadied herself, her eyes briefly drifting toward the window where the fur scattered. Lights of the city came into view below, glowing against the darkness like a distant constellation. Alexander followed her gaze for a moment, then looked back at her, as if the view outside no longer held the same importance. Before he could speak, movement at the front of the cabin drew attention. A man in a dark suit stepped into the aisle from the galley area, followed closely by another. Their presence was immediate, not because they were loud, but because of the quiet authority in the way they moved. They scanned the rows quickly, their eyes focused, purposeful. The nearest flight attendant approached them with a polite but cautious expression. "Sir, you cannot be in this area during landing," she said, keeping her voice controlled. The man in the suit leaned slightly toward her, speaking in a low tone that did not carry far, but whatever he said caused her expression to change instantly. Her posture straightened, her earlier firmness replaced by something closer to uncertainty. She glanced toward the rows, then back at him, nodding once before stepping aside. The two men continued down the aisle, their pace steady, their focus unwavering. Passengers began to notice, conversations quieting again, curiosity pulling their attention forward. The well-dressed man who had spoken earlier leaned out into the aisle slightly, his brows furrowed. "What is going on now?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Emily watched the scene unfold. Her curiosity piqued, but her posture unchanged. Alexander remained still, his expression calm, though his eyes followed the approaching figures with quiet recognition. When the men reached their row, they stopped. One of them stepped slightly forward, his gaze settling directly on Alexander. There was a brief pause, a moment where the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath without realizing it. Then the man spoke, his voice low but clear. "Sir, we have been looking for you." The words did not need to be loud to carry. They landed with weight, rippling outward through the nearby seats. Emily blinked, her attention snapping fully into focus. The flight attendant who had questioned him earlier stepped closer again, her face now marked by confusion rather than authority. "Is there an issue?" she asked, her voice uncertain. The man in the suit shook his head slightly, never taking his eyes off Alexander. "No issue," he said. "We just need to escort him once we land." The choice of words was careful, controlled, but it only deepened the tension. Across the aisle, the well-dressed passenger leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence faltering. The quiet assumptions that had filled the cabin began to shift, replaced by something far less certain. Emily looked down at Alexander, her expression searching now, as if trying to reconcile the man she had spoken to with the one these strangers seemed to recognize. Alexander met her gaze, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, something unspoken but unmistakable. Not an explanation, not yet, but a quiet acknowledgement that the moment they had been sharing was about to change. Outside the window, the city lights grew brighter as the plane descended further, the ground rising to meet them. Inside the cabin, however, the distance between what people thought they knew and what was about to be revealed had never felt greater. The wheels had not yet touched the ground, but the energy inside the cabin had already shifted beyond recognition. The words spoken moments earlier still lingered in the air, quiet but heavy, impossible to ignore. "Sir, we have been looking for you." They echoed not just in sound, but in the way every nearby passenger now looked at the man who had, until recently, been dismissed as someone who did not belong. The plane continued its descent, the angle of the cabin tilting slightly forward, but no one seemed focused on the landing anymore. All attention had narrowed to a single row. Alexander remained seated for a moment longer, his posture composed, his expression unchanged. Then, slowly, he reached down and placed the empty water bottle and the folded napkin on the tray in front of him, as if setting aside something more significant than the objects themselves. He stood up with a quiet steadiness that carried a different kind of presence now, something that did not need to announce itself to be felt. The man in the suit straightened immediately, his posture shifting into something closer to respect than authority. "Mr. Reed," he said, this time more formally, his voice still controlled, but unmistakably deferential. That was the moment everything changed. The name moved through the cabin like a shockwave. A few passengers blinked, confused at first. Then slowly, recognition began to surface. A woman, too, rose back, gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. "Reed," she whispered to the person beside her. "Alexander Reed." The well-dressed man across the aisle froze, his earlier confidence dissolving completely as realization took its place. He leaned back in his seat, eyes widening slightly as he looked at the man he had judged so quickly. The flight attendant who had questioned him stepped back instinctively, her expression shifting from controlled authority to visible uncertainty. "Mr. Reed," she repeated quietly, as if trying to reconcile the name with the situation she had just been part of. Alexander inclined his head slightly toward the man in the suit, acknowledging him, then turned his attention back to Emily. For a brief moment, the noise of the cabin seemed to fade again, the two of them existing in a space separate from the reactions building around them. Emily stared at him, her mind trying to catch up, to connect the calm, tired man she had spoken with to the name that now carried weight far beyond this flight. "You are," she began, but the words did not fully form. He gave a small nod, not proud, not distant, just honest. "Yes," he said quietly. There was no explanation attached, no attempt to justify or impress. Just the truth, simple and undeniable. Around them, the shift in behavior was immediate and unmistakable. The same passengers who had whispered earlier now sat straighter, their expressions altered, some embarrassed, some uncertain, some already trying to adjust their posture, as if it could rewrite what had just happened. The well-dressed man who had spoken against him avoided eye contact completely now, his gaze fixed firmly on the seat in front of him. The flight attendant stepped forward again, her voice softer, careful. "Mr. Reed, I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience earlier," she said, each word measured. "We were not aware." Alexander looked at her briefly, then gave a slight shake of his head. "You treated me the way you thought I deserved," he said calmly. "There is nothing to apologize for." The words were not harsh, but they carried a weight that settled over the cabin more heavily than any accusation could have. Silence followed, thick and reflective. Outside, the runway lights stretched out below them, guiding the plane toward its landing. Inside, however, something far more significant had already touched down. And as Emily stood there, still holding onto the seat for balance, her world quietly shifting in ways she had not expected, she realized that the man she had helped was not just someone important. He was someone who had just revealed a truth that would change everything that came next. The moment the plane touched the runway, a subtle jolt ran through the cabin, followed by the long, steady roar of reverse thrust as the aircraft slowed down. But inside, no one reacted the way they usually would. There were no relieved sighs, no casual conversations picking back up. Instead, a heavy silence lingered, filled with the weight of realization. The man they had judged, dismissed, and quietly ridiculed was now standing in the aisle, his presence unchanged yet completely redefined in their eyes. Alexander Reed did not look any different than he had before, but now every detail about him seemed to carry a different meaning. The calm in his posture was no longer seen as indifference. It was control. The quiet in his voice was no longer uncertainty. It was restraint. And the exhaustion in his eyes was no longer weakness. It was the weight of responsibility. The plane taxied slowly toward the gate, but the emotional distance the passengers were traveling felt far greater. One by one, something began to shift. It started with a woman seated near the aisle, the same one who had whispered his name moments earlier. She stood up, not to reach for her bag, not to move into the aisle, but simply to face him. "I am sorry," she said, her voice soft but clear enough to carry. Heads turned again. The apology hung in the air, unexpected, unprompted. Alexander looked at her for a brief moment, then gave a small nod, not dismissive, not accepting in a dramatic way, just acknowledging. Then another movement followed. The well-dressed man who had spoken earlier shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as if wrestling with something internal. For a second, it looked like he might remain where he was, silent, avoiding the moment. But then he stood up as well. His movements were slower, less certain. "I should not have said what I said," he admitted, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. "I did not know." Alexander held his gaze this time, his expression calm but steady. "That is the point," he replied. The words were simple, but they landed with unmistakable clarity. A ripple moved through the cabin again, but this time it was different. It was not curiosity. It was awareness. One by one, more passengers began to rise. Some said nothing, their silence filled with quiet acknowledgement. Others offered brief apologies, their voices carrying regret, embarrassment, or simply the need to correct something they could no longer ignore. The movement spread row by row, not organized, not planned, but driven by something collective, something human. Even the flight attendant stepped forward again, her posture no longer defined by authority, but by humility. "Mr. Reed," she said carefully, "I truly am sorry for how this was handled." Alexander looked at her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Thank you," he said, his tone even. "I hope next time it is handled differently for someone else." The words were not accusatory, but they carried a quiet challenge, one that extended beyond the moment, beyond the flight. She nodded quickly, understanding more than she said aloud. By the time the plane reached the gate and came to a full stop, nearly half the cabin was standing, not for departure, not for convenience, but for something else entirely. Something that had begun with a simple act of kindness and had grown into a moment no one would forget. Emily stood there, still in the aisle, her hand resting lightly against the seat, her expression caught between surprise and something deeper. She had not expected any of this. She had not helped him for recognition or reaction or change. But now, as she looked around and saw the people who had once judged him, now standing in quiet respect, she realized that what she had done had reached far beyond a single seat on a single flight. Alexander turned toward her once more, and in that moment, the noise of the cabin faded again, leaving only the space between them. Because while the world around them had finally begun to understand who he was still thinking about who she had been from the very beginning. And that, more than anything else, was what stayed with him. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime, and almost immediately the cabin shifted from stillness and emotion, but not in the usual hurried, impatient way. People did not rush to grab their bags or push into the aisle. Instead, there was a strange pause, as if no one quite wanted to break the moment that had just unfolded. Then slowly, one by one, passengers began to reach for their belongings, but their movements were quieter, more deliberate, their earlier confidence replaced by something more reflective. The overhead bins opened with soft clicks, carry-on bags pulled down, but conversations remained low, almost respectful. Alexander stepped slightly aside to allow others to pass, his posture relaxed, his presence no longer questioned, but quietly acknowledged. The two men in suits remained nearby, attentive but not intrusive, waiting for the right moment to guide him forward. Emily finally shifted her weight fully off the seat she had been holding, her legs protesting slightly as she took her first real step in hours. She exhaled softly, adjusting her jacket, her movements small, almost unnoticed in the larger flow of passengers beginning to exit. For a moment, she considered simply blending into the line, walking off the plane like everyone else, letting the experience fade into memory. But before she could take another step, Alexander spoke. Emily. Her name stopped her. She turned back, her eyes meeting his again, and for a brief second, everything else faded. The noise of the cabin, the movement of passengers, even the presence of the men waiting for him seemed to disappear. You never told me your last name, he said, his tone calm but intentional. She hesitated, then gave a small, almost self-conscious smile. Brooks, she said. Emily Brooks. He nodded, as if committing it to memory, not casually, but with purpose. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, his movements unhurried, and pulled out a simple business card. It was clean, minimal, the kind that did not need excess to carry weight. He held out to her. If you're ever in the city, he said, or if you want something different than standing for a few hours on a flight, call me. Emily looked at the card but did not take it right away. Her eyes lifted back to his, searching, cautious. Why? She asked quietly. There was no accusation in her voice, just honesty. Because I gave you my seat, she added. Alexander shook his head slightly. No, he said, because you saw me before anyone else did. The words settled between them, simple but undeniable. Emily's fingers finally reached out, taking the card, her grip light but steady. She glanced down at it briefly, then slipped it carefully into her jacket pocket, as if unsure what it would mean, but unwilling to dismiss it. I do not know if I belong in your world, she said after a moment, her voice softer now. Alexander's expression shifted, not into something distant or superior, but into something more grounded. Maybe not, he replied, but I'm starting to think I might belong in yours. The honesty in that statement caught her off guard, and for a second, she did not know how to respond. Around them, the flow of passengers continued, the line moving steadily toward the exit, but the space between them felt untouched by it. One of the men in suits stepped forward slightly, a subtle reminder that time was moving, that there were expectations waiting beyond the plane. Alexander glanced toward him briefly, then back at Emily. I will not forget this, he said. She gave a small smile, the kind that carried both warmth and uncertainty. It was just a seat, she replied again, echoing her words from earlier. But this time, neither of them believed it was just that. As the line thinned and the exit drew closer, Emily finally turned, stepping into the flow of passengers, her pace unhurried, her mind still catching up with everything that had happened. Behind her, Alexander remained for a moment longer, watching her go, the card no longer in his hand, but something far more important now carried with him. Because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what he could offer someone. He was thinking about what he had just received. The airport terminal was alive with motion, the steady flow of travelers moving in every direction, rolling suitcases echoing softly against polished floors, overhead announcements blending into the background like distant waves. But for Emily, everything felt slightly muted, as if she were still suspended somewhere between the sky she had just left and the ground beneath her feet. She walked slowly, her hand brushing against the pocket of her jacket where the card rested, her fingers tracing its edges as if confirming it was real. Outside the terminal, the cool night air wrapped around her, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the glow of city lights stretching far into the distance. For a moment, she stood there, watching people rush past, each of them moving towards something certain, something familiar. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the card again. Alexander Reed. The name no longer felt distant or abstract. It felt connected to a moment she could not forget. Days passed, then a week, and then another. Life returned to its usual rhythm. Early mornings at the diner, late nights cleaning office floors under fluorescent lights, the quiet exhaustion that came with routines that left little room for anything else. The card stayed with her, sometimes tucked safely away, sometimes held in her hand during quiet moments when the world slowed down just enough for her to think. She did not call right away. Part of her wondered if she should. Another part told her that people like him did not cross paths with people like her more than once. But something about the way he had looked at her, the way he had spoken, stayed with her. One evening, after a long shift, she found herself standing outside a public phone booth near the subway entrance, the city alive around her, headlights passing, voices overlapping, life moving forward as it always did. She took the card out again, her fingers steady this time. Then, without overthinking it, she dialed the number. The line rang once, then twice, and then it was answered. "This is Alexander." His voice came through, calm and unmistakable. For a second, she said nothing, surprised that he had answered himself. Then she smiled, even though he could not see it. "It is Emily," she said. There was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition. "Emily Brooks," he replied, as if he had been expecting that name. "I was wondering when you would call." A week later, Emily stood in front of a glass building that seemed to stretch endlessly upward, its surface reflecting the sky above like a mirror. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The lobby was quiet, polished, every detail precise, but she did not feel out of place the way she thought she might. At the far end, near the elevators, Alexander was waiting. Not surrounded by assistants or security, not distant or unreachable, but standing there, just as she remembered him. When he saw her, he stepped forward and without hesitation, he reached for the chair beside him and pulled it out. This time, he said, a faint smile in his voice, "You are not standing." Emily let out a soft laugh, the tension she had carried easing in an instant as she took the seat. "I guess things have changed," she said. Alexander shook his head slightly as he sat across from her. "No," he replied. "The important part has not." She looked at him, curious. "What is that?" she asked. He held her gaze, steady and certain. "The fact that you saw me when no one else did," he said. "And now I see you." The city moved on outside those glass walls, fast and indifferent, but inside, something quieter had taken root. Not built on status or expectation, but on a moment that had started with a simple act and ended with something real. And for both of them, it was only the beginning.